The haunting trail. I've always loved hiking. The thrill of exploring new trails, the serenity of nature, and the challenge of pushing my limits have always drawn me to the wilderness. So when I heard about the Whispering Pines Trail, a remote path deep in the heart of the forest, I knew I had to conquer it. The trail was infamous for its eerie occurrences and the unsettling stories told by those who dared to hike it. But I was skeptical. Ghost stories and local legends never scared me. I was more interested in the untouched beauty of the trail and the adventure it promised. I packed my gear, made sure I had enough supplies for a few days, and set out early one crisp autumn morning. The drive to the trailhead was long and winding, taking me through dense forests and past sleepy little towns. As I neared my destination, the road became narrower and more rugged, until it was little more than a dirt path cutting through the trees. When I finally arrived, I was greeted by a small weathered sign that read, Whispering Pines Trail. The air was cool and fresh, and the forest was alive with the sounds of birds and rustling leaves. I took a deep breath, adjusted my backpack, and started down the trail, eager to see what lay ahead. The first few miles were uneventful. The trail was well marked and easy to follow, winding through groves of towering pines and across babbling brooks. The sunlight filtered through the canopy, casting dappled shadows on the forest floor. It was peaceful, almost idyllic. As I rounded a bend, I saw an old man sitting on a fallen log by the side of the trail. He looked up as I approached, his eyes sharp and piercing. "You're heading up the Whispering Pines Trail, aren't you?" he asked, his voice gravelly. I nodded. "That's right. Have you been up there?" He shook his head slowly. "No, but I've heard the stories. They say the trail is haunted, that those who venture too far never come back the same. Be careful, young man. The forest has a way of playing tricks on the mind." I thanked him for the warning, though I didn't take it too seriously. Ghost stories were just that, stories. I continued on my way, the old man's words lingering in the back of my mind. As the day wore on, the trail became steeper and more rugged. The trees grew closer together, their branches intertwining to form a dense canopy overhead. The air grew cooler, and the forest seemed to grow quieter, as if holding its breath. It was then that I began to notice the first signs of something unusual. A rustling in the bushes that stopped as soon as I turned my head. Shadows that seemed to move just out of the corner of my eye, and the feeling that I was being watched, though I was certain I was alone. I tried to brush it off as paranoia. The forest was full of animals, and shadows could play tricks on the mind. But the feeling persisted, growing stronger with each step I took. By late afternoon, I had reached a particularly remote and overgrown section of the trail. The trees were so thick that they blocked out most of the sunlight, casting the forest in a perpetual twilight. The path was narrow and uneven, and I had to watch my step to avoid tripping over roots and rocks. As I pushed through a thicket of underbrush, I stumbled upon an old, abandoned campsite. The remnants of a fire pit, a tattered tent, and scattered belongings lay strewn about, as if the occupants had left in a hurry. A chill ran down my spine as I examined the site. There was something unsettling about it, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I decided to set up camp a little further down the trail, away from the abandoned site. As I pitched my tent and prepared my dinner, the forest grew darker and more silent. The usual sounds of wildlife were absent, replaced by an eerie stillness. That night, as I lay in my tent, I heard the whispers, faint at first, like the rustling of leaves in the wind, but growing louder and more distinct. They seemed to come from all around me, voices speaking in hushed tones just beyond the edge of my hearing. I sat up, my heart pounding in my chest. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and I could make out words, fragments of sentences that made no sense. Leave, not safe, beware. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent, shining the beam into the darkness. The forest was still and silent, but the whispers continued, growing louder and more frantic. I stepped out of the tent, my flashlight casting long shadows on the trees. And then I saw it, a figure, pale and ghostly, standing at the edge of the clearing. It was a woman, her eyes wide and filled with sorrow. She raised a hand, as if to beckon me closer. I took a step back, my heart racing. The whispers grew louder, more urgent. Leave. Now. I stumbled back in my tent, my mind racing. The whispers continued, filling my head with a cacophony of voices. I tried to block them out, to focus on something else, but it was impossible. The forest seemed to close in around me, the darkness pressing in from all sides. I knew I had to leave, to get away from whatever was haunting the trail. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could, my hands shaking. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and I could feel the presence of the ghostly figure watching me. As I started back down the trail, the forest seemed to come alive with shadows and whispers. I could see figures moving just out of the corner of my eye, hear footsteps behind me. The air grew colder, and I could see my breath misting in the beam of my flashlight. I ran, my heart pounding in my chest, the whispers growing louder and more frantic. The trail seemed to twist and turn, leading me deeper into the forest. I could feel the presence of the ghostly figure behind me, growing closer with each step. I stumbled and fell, my flashlight rolling away. The darkness closed in around me, and I could hear the whispers all around me. I scrambled to my feet, my hands shaking, and grabbed my flashlight. And then I saw her, the ghostly figure standing just a few feet away, her eyes filled with sorrow. She reached out a hand, and I felt a cold chill run down my spine. "Leave now," she whispered, her voice echoing in my mind. I turned and ran, my heart pounding in my chest. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, and I could feel the presence of the ghostly figure behind me. I ran until I could run no more, collapsing on the ground, gasping for breath. When I finally made it back to the trailhead, the sun was just beginning to rise. The forest was bathed in a golden light, and the whispers had faded to a distant murmur. I stumbled to my car, my mind racing with the events of the night. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly escaped something terrible. The Whispering Pines Trail had lived up to its reputation, and I knew I would never forget the haunting experience. I later learned that the trail was indeed haunted by the spirits of hikers who had lost their way and never returned. The ghostly figure I had seen was one of them, a woman who had died on the trail many years ago. Her spirit, and the spirits of others like her, still roamed the forest, warning those who dared to venture too far. I vowed never to return to the Whispering Pines Trail, but the memory of that night would stay with me forever. The forest had a way of seeping into your soul, leaving an indelible mark. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly escaped something far worse than I could ever imagine. Months passed, but the experience on the Whispering Pines Trail haunted me. I found myself drawn to the forest, unable to forget the ghostly figure and the whispers that had filled my mind. I began to research the trail's history, hoping to find some closure. I discovered that the trail had been the site of numerous disappearances over the years. Hikers, campers, and even seasoned outdoorsmen had ventured into the forest, never to be seen again. The locals spoke of the trail with a mixture of fear and reverence, believing it to be cursed. One name kept appearing in my research: Emily Carter. She was the woman whose ghost I had seen. Emily had been an avid hiker, much like myself, and had disappeared on the trail over a decade ago. Her body was never found, but her spirit was said to haunt the forest, warning others of the dangers that lurked within. I couldn't shake the feeling that Emily had saved me that night. Her ghostly warning had driven me to leave the trail before it was too late. I felt a strange connection to her, as if our fates were intertwined. One day, I decided to visit Emily's family. I found her parents living in a small town not far from the trailhead. They were kind and welcoming, though their eyes held a deep sadness. I told them about my experience on the trail, about the ghostly figure and the whispers. They listened intently, their faces pale. Emily loved that trail, her mother said, tears in her eyes. She always said it was her favorite place in the world. We never believed the stories about it being haunted, but after she disappeared, we started to wonder. Her father nodded. We've heard others speak of seeing her ghost. It brings us some comfort to know that she's still out there, watching over the trail she loved so much. I left their home with a heavy heart, but also a sense of peace. Emily's spirit was not lost. She was still there, protecting others from the same fate that had befallen her. I knew I would never forget her, or the haunting experience on the Whispering Pines Trail. As I drove away, I glanced back at the forest, its dark silhouette looming against the sky. The whispers had faded, but the memory of that night would stay with me forever. The trail had left its mark on me, a reminder of the thin veil between the living and the dead, and the spirits that linger in the shadows. Story number 01. The Trail of Echoes. The first time I heard the trail's legend, I brushed it off as some local campfire story. The Trail of Echoes was supposed to be haunted, just the kind of spooky rumor to keep campers on edge. But of course, I couldn't resist a good story. So one foggy autumn morning, I grabbed my gear and headed out to see it for myself. The trail was buried deep in the mountains, hours from the nearest town. When I got there, I was the only car in the parking lot, which didn't surprise me. The fog hung thick over the trees, curling through the branches and muting every sound. The silence was absolute, like even the birds were holding their breath. As I stepped onto the trail, the world seemed to shrink. The fog blurred everything more than a few feet away, leaving only the narrow, twisting path ahead. The trees, gnarled and old, seemed to lean in close, watching me. I chuckled to myself, trying to shake off the nerves. I was just letting my imagination get to me. Or so I thought. About an hour in, I came across an old, weathered signpost. The words were barely legible, worn by years of rain and moss, but I could just make out the phrase, "Whisper Trail, stay on the path." I felt a prickling at the back of my neck. I'd heard that name before. Whisper Trail was another local legend, the place where hikers supposedly vanished, never to be seen again. But curiosity pushed me forward. The path narrowed, barely wide enough to walk without brushing against the underbrush. The fog was thicker now, swallowing sound. That's when I heard it, a faint whisper drifting through the mist. "Help, please, over here." I froze. My first thought was that maybe someone was lost or injured, but there was something off. The voice was so faint, almost like a breeze rather than an actual cry for help. I called out, asking if anyone was there, but the only response was a soft, ghostly echo of my own words. "Is anyone there?" It whispered back, sending chills down my spine. I kept walking, hoping it was just my mind playing tricks. But every few minutes, I hear it again, the voice, growing closer, repeating itself like it was following me. "Please, over here." I quickened my pace, trying to ignore it, but the voice only grew louder, more insistent. Eventually, I reached the split in the path. The left trail was wider, the safe route back to the parking lot, but the right path wound deeper into the fog. And there, just barely visible in the mist, was a figure. They stood motionless at the start of the right trail, their back to me, wearing a tattered jacket and a backpack covered in mud. I felt a strange pull, an urge to follow, but something inside me screamed to stay away. I called out, but the figure didn't respond. It just stood there, unmoving. The air was thick with tension, and every instinct told me to run. But I stepped closer, cautiously, trying to see if they needed help. As I got closer, I noticed something odd. Their feet didn't touch the ground. They were hovering, barely an inch above the dirt, swaying gently in the fog. That's when the figure turned. Its face was pale, with hollow, sunken eyes and a mouth twisted into a silent scream. It stared at me, unblinking, and then it began to move, drifting slowly backward down the trail, beckoning me to follow. My body locked in place. A wave of cold washed over me, and my heart thundered in my chest. Somehow, I knew that if I followed, I'd be lost forever, just like all the others who had disappeared on this path. But the pull was so strong, like something was reaching out, wrapping around me, urging me to take just one step closer. With every bit of strength I had, I forced myself to look away. I turned and sprinted down the left path, my footsteps pounding against the earth as I raced back to the parking lot. The whispers followed me, growing louder, angry, pleading. "Please, don't go. Come back." But I didn't stop until I reached my car, slamming the door and fumbling with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely turn the ignition. As I sped away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, and there, standing at the edge of the trailhead, was the figure watching me leave, its hollow eyes fading into the fog. To this day, I don't know what would have happened if I'd followed, but I do know one thing: I'll never hike that trail again. Story number 02: The Silent Watchers. I first heard about the Silent Watchers from a friend who was all about the local legends. They're these strange rock formations, he'd said, way out on Briarwood Trail. People say they're cursed. At the time, it sounded like nonsense, but a few months later, I found myself with a free weekend, so I decided to check it out. Briarwood Trail was remote, hours from the nearest town, winding through dense forest and rocky hills. Just the kind of quiet escape I liked. The first half of the hike was uneventful, even serene. Birds chirped, the sun filtered through the leaves, and the path was empty. But as I neared the area where the Silent Watchers were supposed to be, the air changed. It grew colder, almost damp, and an eerie silence settled over the forest. No birds, no rustling leaves, just my own footsteps crunching along the trail. Then, up ahead, I saw them. The Silent Watchers were strange, all right. A series of stone pillars, twisted and eroded, stood scattered in a small clearing off the trail. They were arranged in a loose circle, leaning slightly, each one pointing in a different direction. They reminded me of stone sentries, hunched over and watching everything, like they'd been placed there with purpose. I took a few steps toward them, feeling a strange pull. The air was thick with the scent of moss and damp earth, and an uneasy feeling prickled the back of my neck. There was something off about this place. Each stone was covered in faint weathered carvings, symbols I didn't recognize, spirals and lines that almost seemed to shift as I stared at them. As I circled the stones, I started to feel strange, lightheaded, like I was moving underwater. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something, a shadow. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, but it was too clear, too deliberate. A dark, human-like shape standing just beyond the stones, watching me. I spun around, but it was gone. That's when I noticed something even more unsettling. The trail back, the one I'd just taken, was gone. In its place was thick underbrush, trees pressing close together as if they'd always been there. I was surrounded by the Silent Watchers, and every direction looked the same. Panic set in. I'd heard about people getting turned around on trails, but I'd never experienced it myself. I tried to retrace my steps, but the more I walked, the more lost I felt. It was like the forest itself was shifting around me, leading me in circles. As the sun started to dip below the trees, the shadows grew longer, and that's when I saw them again. Shapes more distinct this time, moving through the trees just beyond the stones. They didn't make a sound. They didn't come any closer. They just watched. The air grew colder with each passing minute, and my breath came out in shallow, foggy puffs. I didn't know how long I had been out there. My phone had lost signal hours ago. I shouted for help, but my voice was swallowed by the trees, coming back to me as a faint, mocking echo. Finally, just as darkness fully settled, I spotted a break in the trees, a narrow path that looked like it led back to the main trail. I didn't care if it was real or just another trick. I ran for it, stumbling over rocks and roots, my legs aching. Behind me, I could hear something moving through the trees, keeping pace, just out of sight. When I broke through the tree line, I found myself back on the familiar trail. I gasped for breath, looking back, but there was no sign of the figures or the Silent Watchers. Just the dark, dense woods, silent and unchanging. The whole way back, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me. I didn't stop until I reached my car, slamming the door shut and locking it, as if that could somehow keep whatever I'd seen at bay. As I drove away, I glanced in my rearview mirror and felt a chill. Just barely visible at the edge of the trail, right where I'd come out, were two shadowy figures standing side by side, watching me leave. I never went back to Briarwood Trail, and I never told anyone about what happened. But sometimes, late at night, I dream about those Silent Watchers, waiting, and I wonder what would have happened if I'd stayed. Story number 03: the cabin in the clearing. I had been hiking for years, and one of my favorite places was a lesser known trail deep in the Pine Hollow forest. It was beautiful, secluded, and untouched, like a different world entirely. But on one particular hike, I came across something that would change how I felt about that trail forever. It was late in the day when I noticed the cabin. I'd been following the trail for hours, yet somehow I'd never seen it before. It sat nestled in a small clearing just off the path, with ivy creeping up its weathered wooden walls and a roof that sagged under the weight of moss. I should have kept walking, but something about it drew me closer, like an invisible hand guiding me to the front door. The air felt heavier as I approached, almost like stepping into a different atmosphere. A chill ran down my spine, but I brushed it off, telling myself it was just an old abandoned building. Maybe an old logging cabin, forgotten by time. The door was slightly ajar, creaking as it swayed in the breeze. I pushed it open slowly, the wood groaning under my hand. Inside, the cabin was empty, save for a few broken chairs and a small table covered in dust. The windows were cracked, casting thin, angled beams of fading light across the floor. The silence was suffocating. Then I noticed something strange. In the corner of the room was a pile of stones stacked neatly, almost like a small shrine. On top was a photo, faded and yellowed with age, of a family, a man, a woman, and a little girl. The faces were blurred, but there was something hauntingly familiar about them. The longer I stared, the more I felt like I knew them, even though I couldn't place why. A sudden noise startled me, like something shifting in the shadows. I whipped around, my heart racing, but there was no one there. Just the empty, creaking cabin and the feeling that I was being watched. Then, faintly, I heard it, a soft humming, like a lullaby. It drifted through the cabin, barely audible, but unmistakable. My blood ran cold as I realized it was coming from the next room. I stepped closer, my feet moving almost against my will. The room was even emptier than the last, save for a single old wooden rocking chair, and it was moving, creaking back and forth as if someone had just left it. The humming stopped abruptly, and for a moment, everything was still. Then, slowly, I felt a cold, invisible hand brush against my shoulder. I spun around, but there was nothing, just the empty room and the eerie silence pressing in on me. Panicked, I turned to leave, but as I reached the front door, something caught my eye. Carved into the doorframe, just at eye level, was a single word: stay. I bolted out of the cabin, racing back to the trail, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I didn't stop running until I was a good mile away, and only then did I look back. In the distance, just barely visible through the trees, was the cabin, but standing in the doorway was a figure, a tall, shadowy shape watching me, unmoving. And though I couldn't see its face, I could feel its eyes on me, tracking my every move. I never hiked that trail again. And to this day, I still see the cabin in my dreams, that shadowy figure standing in the doorway, whispering the same word carved into the doorframe. Story number 04, The Vanishing Trail. It was supposed to be an easy hike, a popular trail known as Mossy Ridge, well-traveled and easy to navigate. I had hiked it countless times before, but that day, everything felt different. The sky was overcast, casting a dull gray light over the forest, and the air was thick and still, with a damp, earthy scent that clung to everything. About 2 miles in, I spotted something strange. The trail forked in a way I'd never seen before. I paused, confused. Mossy Ridge was straightforward. There were no splits or diversions. But here was a new path veering off to the left, partially hidden by thick underbrush. I felt an unexplainable urge to follow it, curiosity outweighing my common sense. As I stepped onto the path, I immediately noticed the silence. There were no bird calls, no rustling leaves, just an unsettling quiet that made me feel as though I'd left the real world behind. The trees seemed older, gnarled, and twisted in strange shapes, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. The deeper I walked, the more the path narrowed, closing in on me, as though the forest itself wanted to swallow me whole. Then, up ahead, I saw something. A wooden sign, old and rotting, barely visible through the tangled branches. It had a single word carved into it: return. My stomach churned. I took a shaky breath and turned around, but the path behind me was gone. In its place was dense forest. The way I had come completely obscured by thick, shadowed underbrush. I felt my pulse quicken. I was sure I'd only gone a few hundred feet. How could the path have disappeared so quickly? With no other option, I pressed on, hoping I'd find another way back. After what felt like hours of walking, I noticed a faint light through the trees. Relieved, I hurried toward it, stumbling into a small clearing. In the middle of the clearing was a stone circle covered in thick, green moss and partially sunk into the earth. But what really caught my attention was the figure standing beside it. It was a woman dressed in hiking clothes, but her skin was unnaturally pale, almost translucent. She looked lost, staring blankly at the stone circle, her mouth moving as though she were speaking, but no sound came out. "Hey," I called, hoping she could help me find my way back. But she didn't respond. She kept murmuring to herself, her gaze unfocused and distant. As I moved closer, I finally made out what she was saying. "Don't follow it. Don't follow it. Don't follow it." A shiver ran down my spine. I tried calling out again, but this time she froze, her head turning slowly toward me. Her eyes met mine, empty and lifeless, like staring into two hollow pits. I took a step back, and she began to walk toward me, her movements slow, almost mechanical. "Don't follow it," she whispered, her voice a raspy, broken echo. Panicking, I turned and ran, pushing through the trees, my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't know where I was going. I just needed to get away from her. The forest grew darker, the air colder, as though night were descending even though it was barely noon. Finally, just as I felt like my lungs might burst, I stumbled back onto the main trail. Relief washed over me, and I looked around, trying to get my bearings. Everything looked normal again. The trail was clear, the trees bright with patches of sun filtering through the clouds. But then, something caught my eye. On a tree next to the trail, scratched into the bark, was a single word: return. I turned to leave, but as I did, I heard it, a faint whisper on the breeze. "Don't follow it." I never took that trail again, but sometimes, even now when I hike other paths, I'll see that same word carved into the trees: return. And I wonder if the woman I saw is still there, trapped in that strange, vanishing trail, warning anyone who might stumble upon it. I still hike, but every time I step onto a new trail, I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched, that somewhere just out of sight, she's there, waiting to give her warning.